Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Outcomes Rocket Founder Stories. I'm really excited to host an amazing guest with us today. His name is Dr. Jeff Wessler. He is a cardiologist, founder, and the CEO at Heartbeat Health. They're transforming the business of cardiology from a digital perspective and really across the entire nation. So I'm excited to have him here with us today. Jeff, thanks for being with us.
Hey, Saul. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You guys are really changing the game in cardiology from access to really delivery. And so we're going to have a chance to really unpack that and why what you guys do is so unique. But before we dive into that, Jeff, I'd love to really learn more about you. What is it that inspired your work in healthcare and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, it was not always in my cards, I'd say, to do entrepreneurship, but it was always in my cards to be in healthcare. My grandfather was a cardiologist. My middle older brother is a cardiologist. We've been keeping it in the family.
That's cool.
And I think about maybe 15 years ago or so, I started to get the bug of, I'd like to really work on how we deliver care. I've always been somewhat fascinated, maybe even obsessed with how we bring new clinical interventions to market, but there seems to have been a gap in how we get something from the approval clinical trial space actually into patients and out to broad swaths of patients who really need and will benefit from it. And that's the space that I took a love and a real focus on in my career. Ultimately, that turned into an entrepreneurship track when I said, hey, cardiology which is the specialty field that I went through with training, and is a field that may be one of the prime opportunities to actually improve that gap between treatment that's amazing but doesn't really get to all the people who need it, and then focus on how do we get that care out there.
I think that's great, Jeff. Oh, were you going to continue? Please go for it.
Well, just to say that I think that ultimately that made its way to Heartbeat Health about 7-8 years ago when I was doing work in the academic setting on different ways of studying, delivering, and getting care out there, and really saw that there was a big opportunity and gap in the market for creating this national decentralized practice to do cardiology and be the provider of services across the US. And that's 8 years later what we've built at Heartbeat, and it seems to be going pretty strong.
Man, that's so cool, Jeff. I love the vision that you had. And we had a nice chat before recording the podcast, just how fast things have changed, right? And so, the entrepreneurial journey is as much vision as it is grit and sticking with it. So as we chat about Heartbeat Health and what makes you guys unique, I want to kind of pull on some of that story and your journey there. But talk to us about Heartbeat Health. What is it that you guys do that's so unique for the people that don't know?
Yeah, Heartbeat is the best way to think of us as a large cardiology practice in the cloud. So we've got hundreds of clinicians doing care across the US, everything from cardiac diagnostics like rhythm monitors and echocardiograms and CT scans, all the way to televisits, e-consults, and then ongoing care, including ordering medications, titrating those medications, for example, for patients with heart failure who have very high care needs and places where they need clinical interactions. And when you think about that care, the big missing component as compared to where things were before Heartbeat is that it is really, really hard to access that care in most parts of the country. There was just a landmark study that came out that's been reported in a lot of the major news outlets about how almost 50%, I think 46 is the actual number, 46% of counties in the US don't have access to a cardiologist. And when you think of such an important high-risk condition, that's almost unacceptable, for people's health, but the outcomes that bears. So that's the gap we play in. That's the place where Heartbeat says, well, we can give you that access and we can provide that care at scale throughout the US.
Man, I mean, that number is staggering. I wasn't aware of that. 46% of counties do not have access to a cardiologist. That is just wild.
That's right. It's amazing. And
in this country.
Country. And we're so used to seeing like a lot of the places where high quality cardiovascular centers actually have 5 academic centers I'm from New York, and we've got 5 academic centers in 5 square blocks of each other. But that's not the majority of care in the US, and that causes some real disparities and real issues for people who need this care.
Totally. So talk to us about your model. You're obviously, improving access, and I would even say equity along the way. It's much needed. How does it work? And do you have an exclusive provider network, or are you partnering with other health systems? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, good question. So over the years, we've worked in different models and finally found our core model, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago, which was we will be the network. So Heartbeat Medical Group now has its own clinicians, everything from cardiologists to advanced practitioners to nurses to care coordinators to sonographers, all doing care. So think of it like a large division of cardiology, but for one thing, which is that no one's in the same location and everyone's doing care across the US.
That's so cool.
We mostly do that care for primary care groups, and particularly groups that are bearing risk, financial risk on their population. And the reason that has become the main model is that those groups stand to benefit from keeping the care in-house. When they have to send somebody out to a fee-for-service cardiologist and then have to foot the bills for the cascade of diagnostic tests they might get or the procedures that they get, it's a lot more cost-effective of a model to say, well, let's keep as much in-house as we can and only send someone when they really need a procedure or really need an advanced diagnostic. Otherwise, we can keep the incentives aligned with improving their outcomes and quality.
That's excellent, Jeff. So you guys have your own network and you're pairing up with primary care and folks that take risks. So you're looking at ACOs, Medicare Advantage, and really kind of this population that could really benefit from this.
That's exactly right. And it happens that Medicare Advantage is growing, maybe the fastest growing line of business in the US right now. By 2030, the majority of patients will be in these accountable care payer contracts. And that matches, it turns out, where the risk of cardiovascular disease lies. It lies in older patients. Medicare and Medicare Advantage patients have much higher risk of cardiovascular disease or much higher prevalence of cardiovascular disease. And it's being severely undermanaged and underdiagnosed simply because of this access problem. It can take months to get to a cardiologist in lots of areas throughout the US.
Amazing. And so with that said, I guess you're partnering with the payer organizations as well, right? To be able to deliver this.
Yep, that's right. So like a lot of health tech companies, we started and said, let's go direct to consumer and build a market there. We actually did okay in the New York area specifically and built a fairly large clinical direct to consumer practice in pretty short time, about a year. Nice. Had several thousand people. But what we found was they weren't the patients who really needed us, who we were going to get the most benefit and help the most. And if we wanted to realize the vision of really inflecting outcomes and care, then we had to work with payers to focus on their patients who needed it the most. And that ended up being a hard transition, but ultimately a fruitful one. And we're in a much better place now that we're directly partnered with those paying for care and also those who know their highest risk members.
That's great. No, that's really, really interesting. Look, we connected. I saw a post that you did on LinkedIn. You were unboxing your 12-lead Cardia. So that really got my attention kind of and where the model is going. We had Dr. Albert, on the podcast. We were at ACC. It was an awesome meeting. Tons of innovation this year. Just incredible, right? Were you there this year, by the way?
I was, and also spent some time with Dave. So we missed each other there.
Man, we missed each other there. I'll catch you next year for sure. Yeah. But I was super intrigued by that because you have this device. So are you guys looking at shifting to start making house calls?
Yeah, good question. So first, just to say, I think the device and diagnostic space in cardiology is changing and accelerating more rapidly than any other. And I think that's one of the things that has kept me so excited about this space over the last decade is that every year a new diagnostic or a new version of a cardiac device comes out that is moving closer and closer to realizing that goal of cardiac diagnostics from home. So we've been, right there with the cutting edge of that trend and using diagnostics as closely as we can to deliver care.
Hmm.
Our rhythm monitoring is probably the first and best example of a use case that works there. So we now run the largest rhythm monitoring program in the country in partnership with a group called iRhythm that
Oh, yeah.
sends rhythm monitors to high-risk individuals or symptomatic individuals to look for arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, which,
Mhm.
if found early enough, can be managed and treated and yield amazing outcomes like prevent strokes, which can be devastating. So these programs, I'd say two things about them. Number one, the potential is just amazing to really change huge, broad outcomes with large populations because you get to get rid of that barrier of having someone to have to go in to a brick and mortar clinic or diagnostic center to get that diagnostic. But the flip side to that is they need to be studied cautiously and carefully to make sure that you're doing more benefit than harm and that the benefit is yielding the right clinical outcomes. So one of the things that I've always brought, I think, to the heartbeat line of thinking, but also to our different partners is the need to say, it won't be the business model that drives this forward and keeps this to be a multi-decades long company and opportunity. It'll be the clinical outcomes. And if this innovation of remote delivered care in cardiology is going to work, then we have to study it. We have to prove that it works and that it's at least as good as, if not better than, similar care being done in the brick and mortar, or I've started calling it the terrestrial world.
I love that, by the way. Love that. Big thinking is where it starts. You have to have vision, and you have vision, Jeff. And I love your vision for this business. Building the company certainly, is never easy. It's never easy to build a company like this. If you could reflect on any setbacks that have really defined the company's future movement, what would you point to?
Over the years, the biggest challenges for us have been every time we've made a big pivot. And most of the time, that has to do with focus and becoming unfocused and chasing too many different things. And so I think in this space in particular, every week I see new opportunities, new directions we could go, new devices or diagnostics or channels that might be a good idea. And I think it's easy to say, look, we got to go chase them all. Focusing and bringing yourself back and saying, actually, let's stick to the model that's working and prove that out first before we expand and move into a new area has been a lesson that hard learned, but one that's paid off over time. And I think when I think about the hard moments over our last 7 or 8 years or so, that those have been the moments that stick out, is when we've had to shut something down, not because it's not a good idea, but because we need to stay focused on what is working and what's going to be most effective for our short and medium term roadmaps.
I love that. Yeah, I remember being at a conference. It was Becker's. And at the time, it was Omar Ishrak, the previous CEO of Medtronic.
Yep.
And he spent like just as much time talking about what they don't do as much as what they do. And like that, just kind of back to what you're saying, it's so important as a founder to really be crystal clear and communicate that. What do you do to communicate that to your team, to investors? Like, what's your process for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll answer that and then give you an example that's happening right now. So number one, I think I have found the need to find clarity myself about what the vision is, what the roadmap is, what our message is first, and then over communicate that again and again and again.
Yeah.
Our company is one of many that are a remote team that's all over the country. We're not all in the same place. So it takes over communication and simple communication of what our goals are, what our vision is, and how we're going to achieve those. And I've found myself learning how to communicate and message things in a much better way than I ever have before. And I think that's the most effective. And then the example that we're facing right now, and I'm sure you're seeing this in your view of the landscape, is value-based care is everywhere, and everyone is talking about value-based care nonstop. My view of the market is that in specialty care, in particular cardiovascular, we're really still a few years off from being ready to do full value-based cardiology. And so even though that is so exciting to work on, it's, that full vision of realizing outcomes at better cost and, quality at scale, we need to take baby steps to get there. And we can't abandon the fee-for-service care model that gets us there. And most importantly, we can't abandon the path that actually proves out outcomes and metrics and milestones before we're ready to take full risk and full value-based care. So that's been a clear point of, me somewhat pushing back against the wave of VBC work that's being pushed on everyone right now and saying, let's take a more measured approach and hopefully that'll pay off in the long run.
Yeah, no, I actually I agree with that approach. And, I've been having a lot of conversations with, the data and analytics companies that are trying to power this type of work and payers. I agree with you. I actually had a friend suggest something similar to what you said, and he called it fee-for-service 2.0. So it's like, this is the evolution. You could buy into that, right? Like, it's something that's more thoughtful. It's not VBC yet, but it's fee-for-service 2.0. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good one. I might steal that line.
It's yours, man. Take it. But it's about advancing it, right? And that's what we're all about. And you guys are all in on this. So I love how you're thinking about this. It's good to be thinking about it. Let's be practical and take those baby steps. Great message from Dr. Wessler. Look, we're here at the end. I wish we could keep chatting about a lot of the different things that you guys have doing. Maybe we'll do a part 2, but kind of here as we're coming to a close, Jeff, what call to action would you leave our listeners with? And what's the best place they could get in touch with you and the Heartbeat crew?
Yeah, so my call to action is, I think, a clear one to focus on building outcomes and evidence. If you start with care that actually generates value, then you can't lose. And if you can use that to tweak the model to find the care model that actually works for patients and outcomes. So focus on that above all else, and you'll land in a really good spot. And then as for where to reach me, I'm always reachable on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share my email, which is Jeff, Jeff, at heartbeathealth.com, and look forward to hearing from anyone.
Amazing. Jeff, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a really great pleasure to chat with you. And for all the listeners, Dr. Jeff Wessler here, cardiologist, founder, and CEO at Heartbeat Health, doing incredible things to transform healthcare for really all of us. It was a pleasure to have him on the podcast. If you heard something that he said that resonated with you, take action on it. So many people listen to podcasts or audiobooks and they just stop with, oh, that was cool. Well, I want you to literally hit pause on this episode, go to LinkedIn and hit Jeff up. Because if you do, I promise you great things will happen. Partnerships will start and you too can improve the populations you serve. So certainly take action. Don't stop at listening. Thank you all for tuning in. And Jeff, I want to thank you for being with us today. This was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Sal. This was great. I really appreciate it.